She came to speak at a medical summit, calm, respected, and qualified. But from the moment she checked in, someone decided she didn't belong. The stares, the questions, the badge suddenly not working, and then being publicly humiliated by a man who saw her identity as a threat. What he didn't expect was that she would document everything. With quiet strength, she built her case. Witnesses stepped forward, allies gathered, and the system that protected him, it started to crumble. But when the smear campaign began, when they tried to silence her, she stood taller. Now the world is watching. This isn't just a story about harassment, it's about what happens when one person refuses to back down. Would you have stayed quiet? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Dr. Kai Rivers stepped out of the shuttle van with a leather satchel slung over one shoulder and a calm, practiced breath drawn deep into their lungs. The retreat center nestled in the rolling hills of rural Virginia was picturesque, an ivy-covered stone facility with large arched windows, manicured lawns, and wood-beamed ceilings meant to evoke rustic luxury. A subtle breeze swept across the parking lot, but Kai barely noticed it. They were too focused. The annual National Medical Ethics Summit was a prestigious event, one Kai had been invited to for the first time. It was an honor to be asked to speak on inclusive trauma care, how marginalized patients often fall through systemic cracks in emergency medicine. It was also a personal mission. Kai, a black, non-binary emergency physician, had built their career not just on clinical excellence but on advocacy for the most overlooked. They weren't here for a vacation. They were here to make sure others like them were seen, heard, and protected. Inside the lobby, the scent of lavender and pine filled the air. The front desk was framed by stacked stone columns and minimalist art. Kai approached the counter, offering a patient smile to the older white man behind it. "Hi there, Dr. Kai Rivers, I'm checking in for the summit. I should be under the block for keynote speakers." The man didn't return the smile. He looked Kai up and down, taking in the fitted navy suit, the neatly tied scarf, the subtle but deliberate earrings, and frowned. "ID?" he asked curtly. Kai offered their government ID and conference registration email. The man glanced at the screen, typed slowly, then looked back up. "Your credentials say doctor," he said. "What kind of doctor?" "Emergency medicine. I work out of Seattle General," Kai answered, keeping their tone even. The man squinted. "You look a little young for that." Kai didn't flinch. "Board certified. I've been practicing nearly 9 years." There was a long pause, then the man finally slid over a keycard. "Room 214, left wing, breakfast at 7, no noise after 10. Kai took the card with a calm nod. "Thank you." As they walked toward the elevator, they made a quiet note in the notepad app on their phone. "Front desk, Charles W. Tone dismissive, asked unnecessary questions credentials. Save ID exchange photo." They weren't paranoid, they were prepared. The room was nice, simple, clean, with floor-to-ceiling windows that opened to a view of the forest. But Kai didn't linger. After unpacking their laptop and laying out materials for tomorrow's talk, they reviewed the summit schedule and made their way downstairs to the opening reception. The event was hosted in a glass-walled conference room decorated with soft lights and minimalist floral arrangements. Doctors, policymakers, and hospital administrators milled about, sipping wine and chatting in clusters. Kai moved through the room with quiet grace, engaging a few people in polite conversation, always gracious but reserved. Most were welcoming, but not everyone. About 30 minutes in, Kai felt someone staring. They turned to see the front desk clerk, Charles, standing just outside the glass wall, arms folded, expression hard. Kai looked away, choosing not to feed it. They weren't going to give him anything. Back upstairs, later that night, they reflected on the moment. Maybe it was nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing. Kai had experienced enough subtle dismissals in their life to know when they were being watched, evaluated, sized up by someone who didn't want them there. It wasn't the first time, but it always hit a similar nerve. Still, they had a job to do. The next morning, Kai dressed early in a crisp charcoal button-up and navy slacks. They braided their short hair back and pinned their ID badge to their lapel. Downstairs, they took a seat in the conference dining hall with a few early risers and nodded politely to a trio of attendees already seated. Charles entered from the rear of the room, surveying the crowd. Then he made a beeline for Kai. "You're not supposed to be seated here," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Kai blinked. "Excuse me. These tables are for keynote guests." Kai tapped the badge on their lapel. "I am a keynote guest." Charles narrowed his eyes. "Really?" Kai reached into their satchel and calmly produced the summit program, flipping to the keynote schedule and pointing to their own name, Dr. Kai Rivers, Inclusive Trauma Care in Emergency Settings. Charles looked at the paper, then at Kai. Then he walked away without a word. The table sat in stunned silence. One of the doctors next to Kai leaned over. "What was that about?" Kai shook their head lightly. Honestly, I think he didn't believe me. Another note went into their phone, dining hall incident, challenged presence, resolved with documentation. Multiple witnesses present. Kai didn't raise a scene, they didn't want drama, they wanted documentation. After breakfast, they presented their talk to a full room of engaged listeners. The reception was warm. One attendee stood and applauded after the final slide. Another asked if Kai would be willing to consult on their hospital's new training protocols. It was a win. But beneath it all, Kai could still feel the weight of the man's gaze. Watching, waiting, by the time dinner rolled around, Kai's stomach was tight with something they couldn't name. They sat alone at a small table in the corner of the banquet hall, reviewing notes for tomorrow. That's when it happened. Charles stormed across the room, face red, holding a clipboard. "You're not cleared for this section," he barked. "You need to come with me." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to them. Kai stood steady and composed. "I believe there's a misunderstanding. I'm a speaker. My badge grants full access." "You're disrupting protocol," Charles snapped, reaching toward Kai's badge. Kai stepped back. "Do not touch me." A woman from the event staff rushed forward. "What's going on?" "This individual isn't listed on the dinner roster," Charles insisted. The woman glanced at Kai's badge, then at her tablet. "Dr. Rivers is not only listed, they're marked VIP. Charles, you need to stop." For a second he froze, then walked away, mumbling. Kai sat down again, heart steady, eyes clear. This wasn't going away, but neither were they. Kai woke early not because of nerves, but because their internal clock was sharp. Years of overnight shifts and early rounds trained their body to be alert before the world stirred. They dressed in a navy sweater, pressed gray slacks, and a pair of modest leather loafers, their badge still clipped neatly to the lapel. They reviewed their presentation notes again, not out of doubt but discipline. Then, with a thermos of tea in hand, Kai headed down to the morning's first panel on ethics in emergency triage. The room was moderately full. Kai took a seat near the front and nodded politely at a few familiar faces from the day before. As the moderator introduced the first speaker, Kai noticed a familiar figure standing near the back of the room. Charles. He wasn't just watching this time, he was taking notes. Kai's stomach tightened. There was no reason for the head of front desk operations to be at a medical summit panel, no reason at all. After the session ended, Kai moved calmly toward the rear exit. As they passed Charles, he offered no acknowledgement, just an icy stare. Kai stepped into the hallway, pulled out their phone, and jotted another log. Charles present in panel room, non-staff, no reason to attend, possible monitoring behavior. The day went on with little drama. Kai networked with hospital administrators, took a few questions about their talk from the previous day, and attended 2 breakout sessions. But Charles continued to appear outside the restroom, in the dining corridor, and even walking by the outdoor seating where Kai ate lunch. Each time he said nothing. Each time he stared just long enough. Kai started asking quiet questions to the staff. "Hey," they said to a young volunteer named Marissa, "does Charles usually attend panels?" Marissa shook her head. "He's front desk and logistics, never seen him inside an event room. Why?" Kai offered a noncommittal shrug, "Just curious." After the final breakout of the day, Kai received a message from Jess, a first-year medical student they'd met during the reception. Jess had been visibly impressed with their talk and asked if they could meet for a quick chat. Kai agreed and suggested the fire pit lounge outside. They met around 6:30 p.m. Jess was bright, earnest, and full of questions about working in trauma units as a queer person of color. "I just never thought I'd see someone like you up there. You carry yourself with so much control, like nothing shakes you." Kai chuckled softly. "Plenty shakes me. I've just learned to move through it without letting it throw me off course." They chatted for a full hour. As they wrapped up, Jess leaned in slightly. "Hey, I don't want to sound paranoid," she said, "but that guy from the front desk, Charles, he was watching you from the trees for a while. I think he thought I didn't notice." Kai's brows furrowed. "Where exactly?" Jess pointed toward the tree line bordering the lounge. "By the bench near the fence. He left when you pulled out your phone earlier." Another entry, another witness. "Thanks, Jess," Kai said. "I appreciate you telling me." Back in their room, Kai compiled a full report, timeline, locations, staff witnesses, and now Jess's account. They included date-stamped screenshots and photos from their camera roll. Then they opened their email. They wrote a concise, fact-based message with attached evidence and a request for consultation. By morning, there was a response. "Thank you for reaching out. We are reviewing your file. Can we schedule a call this afternoon?" Kai leaned back in their chair, breath steady. They weren't overreacting. They were preparing. Because something about this felt bigger than a single man at a front desk. It felt like the beginning of a pattern finally being revealed. The call with Justice Care was brisk, professional, and validating. The attorney on the other end, a sharp-voiced woman named Lauren, confirmed that Kai's instincts were right. You're dealing with targeted harassment, and from what you've documented, this isn't the first time he's done it. Kai didn't flinch. I'm not surprised. Lauren offered to connect them with a local civil rights advocate who could assist if the situation escalated. They agreed. Then Kai returned to the day's schedule, now armed not only with documentation but with legal backing. That afternoon, Kai was scheduled to attend a workshop titled Redesigning Care for Marginalized Patients. It was a topic close to their heart. But just before the session began, an event coordinator pulled them aside. Dr. Rivers, I hate to ask, but could we speak for a moment, privately? Kai followed the young woman into a side room. She looked uneasy. There's been a complaint filed anonymous. It alleges you've been wandering into staff-only areas and possibly confronting team members. Kai's breath caught for just a second. That's not true. I haven't stepped anywhere that isn't clearly marked as guest accessible, and I've had multiple staff witnesses present at every encounter. The coordinator wrung her hands. I believe you, truly, but someone on the property is trying to escalate this, and off the record, we think it's Charles. Kai felt the heat rise in their chest, but still, they didn't let it show. Thank you for letting me know. I'll be documenting this just like everything else. Please do, we're watching now too. The rest of the session went smoothly, but Kai could feel a different kind of spotlight following them. Some attendees offered warm glances of encouragement, others whispered as they passed. Still, they remained calm, focused. After all, this wasn't their first time walking into a room where they weren't expected or wanted. After the workshop, Kai found Jess waiting near the lunch buffet. Jess's smile dropped the second she saw Kai's face. What happened? They tried to claim I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. Anonymous complaint. Jess rolled her eyes. He's grasping, but you're not alone. People are noticing. Kai smiled faintly. That helps, really. Later that evening, Kai returned to their room to find their badge didn't work. The door blinked red. Locked. They tried again, same result. They walked to the front desk, Hart already knowing what was coming. Charles was there. Badge isn't working, Kai said evenly. Charles smirked. Oh, that must be a system error. I'll issue you a temporary key. He handed over a plain white card, no name, no ID, just a generic placeholder. He didn't look them in the eye. Kai took it, said nothing, and walked away. Back in the room, they logged the event. Then they opened their laptop and began a file titled Intentional Obstruction Day 3. They weren't documenting for their own sake anymore. They were preparing for exposure. The next morning, the situation escalated again. Kai arrived at the main ballroom for the keynote panel, a panel they were scheduled to moderate, only to be stopped by a junior staffer who looked mortified. I'm so sorry, Dr. Rivers, she said. There's been a room change. The coordinator told me to let you know. It's now in breakout C. Kai tilted their head. That's a much smaller room. I know, the staffer whispered, and they didn't move the rest of the panel. Kai paused, so the rest of the panel is still in the ballroom. The girl nodded. They said you'd been reassigned. Kai inhaled slowly, then turned and walked down the hallway. They didn't go to breakout C instead, they made their way straight to the event organizer's office. Emily, the senior conference director, looked startled as Kai entered. I'd like to understand why I've been removed from the keynote panel, Kai said plainly. Emily's face reddened. I wasn't told that happened, let me check. She opened her laptop, brows furrowing as she scanned the screen. Your name was removed this morning, she said, her voice low. That edit was made manually. Charles has admin-level access to our room assignments because he's site operations. Kai blinked once. That's the third time he's interfered with my access. Emily leaned back. This is serious, let me make a few calls. Please do, and for the record, I've documented every step of this. Witnesses, screenshots, timestamps. Emily nodded slowly. Good, because it looks like we're going to need it. By mid-afternoon, Emily had reinstated Kai's name on the keynote roster, issued an apology over the internal channel, and pulled Kai aside for a private conversation. We've had complaints about him before, she said, but never anything that stuck. This might finally be enough. Kai stayed silent for a moment, then said quietly, It's not just about him. It's about the system that allowed him to keep doing this to people like me. Emily nodded solemnly, You're right. And I want to help fix it. That night, Kai received a message from Lauren. The civil rights partner is interested in a preliminary case review. We need everything you've documented. We're moving this forward. Kai stared at the message, then looked around the quiet room. They were calm, they were ready, because the first confrontation was over. Now came the reckoning. By the following morning, word had quietly spread through the summit halls. Something had happened to Dr. Kai Rivers, something unjust. Though no official announcements had been made, people were whispering. Staff members exchanged glances when Kai passed. Attendees who had previously been cordial were now openly sympathetic. The tide, though subtle, had begun to shift. Kai noticed it right away. A nurse manager from Chicago offered to walk with them between panels. A hospital administrator made a point of complimenting their keynote contributions in front of others, and Jess, ever vigilant, was constantly nearby, checking in, showing support. After lunch, Emily found Kai in the hallway outside the main ballroom. "Do you have 10 minutes?" she asked. Kai nodded, following her to a side room where a woman with short blonde hair and a confident stance stood waiting. "Kai, this is Michelle Langford," Emily said. "She's our external compliance liaison. I brought her in after reviewing your documentation." Michelle extended her hand. "Dr. Rivers, I've read your file, I believe you, and I'd like to help you get this elevated." Kai raised an eyebrow slightly. "Elevated how? We have protocols for internal misconduct, but this goes beyond that. This is targeted harassment, and if we don't act quickly, the liability spreads beyond Charles. It touches everyone who failed to stop him." Kai leaned forward slightly. "So what are the next steps?" Michelle glanced at Emily. "We need you to submit a formal complaint through our system, yes again, but this time with our new witness reports." Emily's gathered 3 statements from staffers who have seen Charles interfere with your badge and panel assignment. Kai nodded. "I'll send it by tonight." Emily added, "Also, we've reached out to our legal team to put Charles on administrative leave during the investigation. You'll be informed once that happens." Kai didn't say thank you, not because they weren't grateful, but because it wasn't a favor, it was overdue action. That afternoon, Kai noticed Charles wasn't at the front desk. In his place was a younger man with an apologetic smile, later just caught up with them outside the dining hall. "Did you hear? He's off the floor. Word is he's been suspended." Kai exhaled quietly. "Good, that's a start." They walked together down the corridor, passing a group of volunteers who paused their conversation as they approached. "Dr. Rivers," one said softly, "thank you for not backing down." Kai nodded politely. "Thank you for noticing." That evening, as Kai finalized their formal complaint, a new email arrived from Michelle. It contained an internal document, part of the hotel's prior incident logs. Buried within it were 3 previous complaints against Charles, 2 from guests, 1 from a former employee. None had been formally escalated. Kai forwarded it directly to Lauren. 10 minutes later, their phone rang. "This is it," Lauren said. "This is your pattern. We'll loop in the civil rights organization tomorrow. Keep collecting and keep quiet for now. Let them move first." The following morning, a printed memo was slipped under every guest's door. It detailed a new code of conduct being implemented immediately for the remainder of the summit. 0 tolerance for harassment, clear reporting channels, and most notably a hotline number for anonymous complaints. Kai read it 3 times. It wasn't victory, but it was momentum. Later that day, Kai delivered a second panel presentation, Designing for Dignity, Queer Patient Advocacy in Emergency Rooms. The room was packed, standing room only. As they spoke, their voice remained even clear, but now each sentence carried a deeper weight. Afterward, a line of attendees waited to shake their hand. One woman, an older ER nurse with gray-streaked hair, looked them in the eye. "What happened to you this week? We've all felt versions of it. Thank you for putting it into words." Kai smiled gently. "I hope someday none of us have to." Back in their room that night, Kai reflected on the last 4 days. They hadn't sought this battle, they had come to teach, to share, but now they were the example. They wrote in their notebook, "People are watching now, make every move count." They knew the next part would be harder. Because when systems are threatened, they push back. But Kai was ready for the pushback. They had an ally, they had evidence, and more importantly, they weren't alone anymore. By the 5th day of the summit, the environment had shifted entirely. What began as whispers and awkward glances had turned into open conversations, pointed questions, and growing scrutiny of the institution itself. People weren't just concerned about Charles anymore, they were asking how this could have gone unchecked for so long. Kai woke early again, as usual. The air outside was damp with mist, the sun just beginning to rise. They took their tea on the small balcony outside their room, scrolling through new emails. There were several messages from attendees thanking them for their bravery, one from a journalist who had heard rumors and wanted a comment, and another from the civil rights organization Lauren had looped in. The organization, Equi-Justice Legal Collective, offered immediate representation. They had seen enough patterns in similar industries to know what this looked like. The difference, they said, was that Kai had built an airtight paper trail. By mid-morning, Kai and Michelle were on a Zoom call with the legal team. They reviewed Kai's timeline, walked through each incident, and matched it with witness statements. Michelle forwarded video clips from hallway security footage showing Charles approaching Kai multiple times with no clear operational reason. "This isn't negligence anymore," said one of the attorneys. "This is systemic enabling." After the call, Michelle pulled Kai aside. "We're preparing for a formal filing. You won't have to carry this alone anymore." Kai nodded, eyes steady. "Good, because it's bigger than me now." That afternoon, Kai was approached in the hallway by a soft-spoken woman named Priya, a hotel housekeeper who had been working in the building for over a decade. "Dr. Rivers," she said, glancing around nervously. "Can I speak with you privately?" They found a quiet corner of the courtyard. "I saw him mess with your badge," Priya said. "He told me to disable it. I didn't want to, but he said I'd be fired if I didn't." Kai's jaw clenched. "Did you report that to anyone?" "No one listens to us," she whispered. "But I saw how you kept standing up. I thought maybe it's time I spoke too." Kai took her hand gently. "Your voice matters, and I'll make sure someone hears it." Later that evening, Kai relayed Priya's testimony to Michelle, who had it notarized and added to the file. It was a breakthrough, proof of Charles weaponizing his position and threatening subordinates to enforce his bias. Meanwhile, social media had begun to stir. An attendee had anonymously posted about what was happening. The thread exploded, with hundreds of users sharing stories of similar discrimination in hotels, conferences, and corporate retreats. "We Belong Here" trended for the next 12 hours. Kai's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support. Former colleagues, medical students, and even complete strangers reached out to say they stood with them. One message read, "You're speaking for more of us than you know." The hotel management, sensing the mounting public pressure, issued a vague statement through email. "We are committed to upholding an inclusive and respectful environment. We take all reports seriously and are reviewing internal procedures." Kai read it and shook their head. "Generic, timed for damage control." Jess, sitting across the room, replied, "They're stalling, they're hoping it blows over." "It won't," Kai said. "Not this time." The next day, Michelle received a leaked memo from a sympathetic employee on the hotel's administrative team. It contained internal communications that revealed top-level awareness of Charles's behavior dating back at least 2 years. There were warnings, even proposed terminations, none of which had been acted on. Kai sat in silence as Michelle read through it. "This is the smoking gun," she said. "They protected him, they knew." Michelle and the legal team met again that night. With Priya's statement, the memo, and the mounting online visibility, they were preparing to go public. "They'll push back hard," Michelle warned. "They'll try to smear your name." "I'm ready," Kai replied. Jess was already collecting screenshots of supportive tweets and preparing a document titled Community Testimony. Emily, now fully in Kai's corner, offered to write a public statement in support of the complaint. Even Marissa, the volunteer from earlier, submitted a signed affidavit. The network of support was growing, and so was the weight of the evidence. The following morning, the front page of a regional news outlet featured the headline, "Keynote Speaker Harassed at Medical Ethics Summit, Hotel Under Scrutiny." The article detailed Kai's background, the timeline of incidents, and included redacted staff witness statements. National media began picking it up. Syndicated news outlets reached out for interviews. Hashtags continued to spread. EquiJustice issued a formal press release announcing a civil complaint being prepared on behalf of Kai Rivers. The hotel's board of directors was now involved. A third-party investigator was assigned to review Charles' conduct and the facility's response. Rumors swirled that several other staff members had quietly submitted complaints in the past 48 hours. Emily met Kai in the courtyard. "There's going to be a press conference. They're trying to control the narrative." "Let them," Kai said. "We'll control the truth." As the sun set, Kai sat in their room, compiling everything into one large folder: emails, timestamps, badge data, testimony, videos. They named it Case Rivers Master File PDF. This wasn't just a retaliation claim. It was a blueprint of how injustice hides behind protocol. And for the first time in days, as they closed the laptop, Kai allowed themselves a small breath of relief. The cracks in the wall were finally starting to show, and this time there was no patching it back up. The morning of the press conference arrived with a quiet tension in the air. Though not officially invited to speak, Kai stood just outside the glass-walled media room, observing the flurry of journalists, PR staff, and hotel executives. Inside, chairs were aligned in perfect rows, cameras were being adjusted, and the podium stood ready with the hotel's insignia branded onto the front. Michelle approached with a calm but urgent energy. "You may not be at that podium, but your presence here is powerful. People need to see you standing tall." Kai nodded. "Visibility matters." As the conference began, the hotel's PR lead, a polished woman in a navy suit, launched into a statement that sounded more like damage control than accountability. "We take all allegations seriously and are committed to a full review of internal practices. We deeply regret any distress caused and are cooperating with the ongoing investigation." Kai stood just beyond the glass doors, where reporters' eyes darted toward them. One reporter raised their hand. "Can you comment on the previous complaints against the accused employee?" The PR lead deflected. "As this is an active investigation, we are unable to comment on personnel matters." Another asked, "Is Dr. Kai Rivers present today, and will they be invited to speak?" Kai didn't flinch. Michelle leaned in and whispered, "They just gave us the microphone." Outside, Kai gave a separate press statement, raw, poised, and factual. "No theatrics, just truth." Surrounded by allies, they outlined their experience, their documentation, and their hope that this would spark permanent change in how professional spaces are policed by personal prejudice. By that afternoon, clips of Kai's statement were circulating online, amassing hundreds of thousands of views. Commentators praised their composure, their clarity, their strength. Kai wasn't just a victim. They were a professional, an advocate, and now a symbol, but with exposure came retaliation. That evening, Michelle received an email flagged urgent. Someone from the hotel's legal team had leaked a file, a months-old dispute from Kai's hospital, an administrative misunderstanding involving patient charts. Though it had been resolved and expunged, the hotel's legal advisors were planning to use it as part of a counter-narrative. "They're trying to paint you as unstable," Michelle said, jaw clenched. "We expected this, we'll beat it, but it's going to get ugly." Kai felt their stomach twist, but they didn't let the panic rise. "Then we respond with facts, with every line of documentation." Jess and Emily sprang into action. Jess gathered character references from doctors and students who had trained under Kai. Emily contacted journalists who had already run stories, providing context for the hospital situation and showing the internal hospital memo that cleared Kai of wrongdoing. Still, the smear campaign began to take hold in certain corners of the internet. Trolls posted that Kai had fabricated the incident, that it was a setup for attention. Anonymous accounts claimed they were exploiting identity politics. It was vicious, exhausting, and unrelenting. Kai turned off comment notifications, but the people who mattered, they kept showing up. Messages of support poured in from queer youth, medical students, nurses, and even patients who had been treated by Kai in the past. Some wrote paragraphs about how Kai's presence in medicine had changed their lives. Others simply said, "Thank you, don't give up." Equijustice moved quickly. They filed an injunction preventing the hotel from circulating any damaging or confidential material related to Kai's employment history. Michelle arranged a full interview with a reputable news network that aired nationally, allowing Kai to speak uninterrupted. The interview went viral. "What would you say to those who say this is just a misunderstanding?" the interviewer asked. Kai looked into the camera. "If silence was enough to keep me safe, I wouldn't be here now. What happened wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the result of a system that allows bias to become policy and hostility to become normalized. I didn't want this spotlight, but if I have it, I'll use it to make sure no one else has to go through what I did, quietly, invisibly." Across the country, hospital ethics boards, conference organizers, and medical institutions began circulating new protocols for handling discrimination claims. Hashtags like "Stand with Kai" and "Fix the System" flooded the timelines. Still, the hotel pushed back. They hired a PR firm to reframe the narrative, portraying themselves as victims of online mob mentality. They issued a counterstatement, claiming that Kai's behavior had been confrontational and disruptive to operations. But the problem for them was that every claim they made had already been refuted by timestamps, security footage, and signed witness testimony. And now the court of public opinion was watching. Kai remained steady. Each attack was met with calm rebuttals and supporting evidence. Michelle and the legal team stayed aggressive in the background, and Emily began organizing a coalition of conference professionals to create an independent review board for future industry events. That night, as Kai sat by the window with their laptop open, a message popped up. It was from Priya. "He did this to another guest last year, a trans woman. She left early. I still remember her crying in the stairwell." Kai stared at the screen. A silence settled around them, not of defeat but of focus. More voices were coming, and the wall that had cracked days ago, it was finally starting to break wide open. They began typing a new note in their journal: "When the system pushes back, push harder." But never alone. The final day of the summit arrived, and the tension that had simmered beneath the surface now hovered thick in the air. Security guards were posted discreetly around the hotel lobby. Journalists hovered near the conference center entrance, hoping to get a statement, a photo, or even a whisper of what was unfolding behind closed doors. Kai stood in front of the mirror that morning, adjusting the lapel of their suit. They looked tired, yes, but resolved. The person staring back at them had weathered storms far more private than this one. But this time the world was watching. The call came in just after breakfast. Michelle's voice was tight but clear. "The board has scheduled a hearing, today, noon. They're calling it an internal review, but it's more than that. We'll be presenting our documentation, and Charles will be required to appear." Kai nodded slowly, "Then let's do it." They arrived at the review room, a high-ceilinged space typically used for executive luncheons. Today, it had been transformed into a hearing chamber. A long table of board members sat at the front. Michelle and two attorneys from Equijustice set up across from them. Kai took their seat beside them. Jess and Emily were in the back, along with several others who had submitted testimony. Charles sat at the far end, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. For the first time, he looked small. The board chair began the proceedings. This is a formal inquiry into the misconduct allegations raised during the National Medical Ethics Summit. We will hear from both parties and review documented evidence. Our goal is to determine the scope of responsibility and the necessary actions moving forward. Michelle opened with a precise, unwavering timeline of events, walking through Kai's documented encounters, the witness testimonies, the badge tampering, the security footage. She laid it out like clockwork. Kai was then invited to speak. They stood slowly, taking a breath. I came here to give a talk about inclusive trauma care. I didn't ask for this spotlight, but when I was followed, accused, blocked, and stripped of access without cause again and again, I knew silence wasn't an option. I documented everything not out of fear but out of necessity, because this is what so many of us are forced to do just to be believed. They paused, scanning the board. What happened here wasn't just a personal attack, it's a failure of your systems, a culture that tolerated bias until it metastasized into abuse. That ends today. Charles was invited to respond. He began with a carefully rehearsed defense, claiming confusion, denial of intent, even suggesting Kai had misunderstood his actions. But the room had changed. Every claim was countered with evidence, time-stamped footage, staff statements, internal memos. One board member leaned forward. "Mr. Whitman, are you aware that 3 employees submitted complaints about your conduct in the last year alone?" Charles hesitated. "I was never formally disciplined." "That's not what we asked." By the time Michelle played the audio clip from a staff break room, Charles angrily ranting about woke hires and people who don't belong here, there was no saving face. The board fell silent. The chair finally spoke. "Effective immediately, Mr. Whitman is terminated. A public statement will follow and a formal apology will be issued to Dr. Rivers. We are initiating a third-party audit of our internal systems." Charles didn't argue. He stood, pale and stunned, and left the room without another word. Kai exhaled. Justice wasn't always swift, but today it had arrived. Outside, the hallway was full. Staff, attendees, even journalists had gathered quietly. When Kai stepped out of the room, they were met with a wave of applause. Jess stepped forward, grinning. "You did it." Kai shook their head. "We did it." The story hit national headlines that evening. Kai gave one final interview, not about the harassment, but about the change it sparked. New guidelines, industry review panels, trainings funded by the settlement. In the following months, Kai returned to their ER unit in Seattle, welcomed by colleagues who had followed every moment. They continued their work calm, focused, tireless, but now with something more, a platform. They began leading training sessions on equity in healthcare. They consulted on policy boards, they mentored queer and trans medical students, and occasionally they received letters from strangers, from other professionals, from people who had once felt invisible. "Thank you for standing up. Thank you for not backing down." On the anniversary of the summit, Kai received a package. Inside was a framed photograph of the courtroom moment the board announced their decision. Attached was a note from Michelle. "You didn't just hold the line, you redrew it." Kai placed it on their office shelf beside a small placard that simply read, "You belong," and they did. Finally, they did.